For this landscape photography adventure, we're in Iceland, hiking through one of the most breathtaking landscapes in the world. I was leading a group of 7 landscape photographers on a 5-day backpacking trip through some truly surreal terrain. In this video, I'm going to shoot a mountain scene that is as epic as they come and take you through my shot selection process. But before the photography starts, we have to get there. So I hope you'll enjoy the hike. And that was more or less it for the day. We did have a few bursts of light and wandered around a hillside looking for views of the nearby mountain. But I didn't really take any images to write home about, so we'll pick it up again the following day with a short hike, followed by some really fantastic landscape photography. Hello everybody from the Icelandic Highlands on day 2 of a trip exploring this beautiful area where you really don't need to be an amazing photographer to take some pretty fantastical pictures. As you can see behind me here, this view is pretty surreal. This is my second time here, but I've got to say the view just completely took my breath away when we turned the corner just now. So I'm going to give you a quick tour. I'm going to hop behind the camera and show you the view that I can see and just explain some of the very simple shot concepts that I'm going to start with this afternoon. So this is the view as we see it at the moment, and you can see there's a rather clear frame there. There's multiple ways you could actually compose this mountain in front of the ice cap here. I think because it's symmetrical, my favourite way to compose it is symmetrically, so centrally, and really emphasise the geometry of the mountain there with, of course, the river there in the bottom of the frame. So I'll just show the kind of crop that I'd probably go for. And then you could also try positioning the mountain off to the left to have this ridge coming in on the right hand side of the frame, so a slightly wider view or even a panoramic view. So this is a scene that lends itself really well to shooting in multiple formats. Then if we look over in this direction towards the ice cap, you can see a nice combination of the ridge, the braided river below, and then there's just a bit of a mountain coming out at the top of the ice cap there. And I think that's going to make a really nice graphic shot with all of those horizontal lines. So that's something that I'm going to try and photograph. And then if I just wander around here, unfortunately, that was the point at which the wind got too much to hear what I was saying, so I'll talk through this last scene with these lovely lines running through the moss-covered hills at the bottom of the frame there, and the mountains giving a focal point and a little bit of a sense of depth as well. So that was the last scene that I was interested in. And you might be wondering why I'm not trying to incorporate the foreground. Well, I did look, but you tend to find a lot of this broken basalt, which in my opinion doesn't really pair very well with such simple scenery. So instead I focused on those shots that I've just shown you, and we're going to go through those now. I'm going to take a different approach to showing you these images. I'm going to show you all of the variants that I shot of these scenes that I introduced. So what I like to do when I have time and the light is changing is broadly decide on the compositions that I'm going to shoot, so how the scene is going to be framed. And then I like to repeat them as the light changes and then sift through them when I get home to find the image that I think has the optimum lighting setup for that particular scene. And you'll see that my logic might change from scene to scene. So I'm going to introduce all of those scenes in this way with a number of images on screen. And if you want, you can pause the video. I'm not going to prompt you to do that, but you can pause the video and pick your favorite before I explain my logic and why I've chosen a particular scene. These four landscape scenes are all broadly similar. Obviously that first image does have the ridge on the right in sunlight, so I'm sure some people would pick that one for that reason. But I'm a bit more interested in the sky and what it means for the image. And those bottom two images, 3 and 4, have the more dramatic clouds. And I think it's 4 with its wider view that really has that oppressive feel to it, with the mountain the only thing in sunlight acting as this sort of beacon of hope in the wider scene. So it's that 4th image that I think I would choose in this case. Each one of the panoramas I shot was comprised of 6 vertical frames, and I actually shot this panorama about 5 times, but I just thought I'd show you these 2 because that's plenty to discuss the main difference, which of course is that ridge in the sunlight again. And partly because I chose the ridge in the shadow for the previous image, and partly because I think the balance is better if the ridge is in sunlight in this particular case, I would choose that second image. The clouds also a lot nicer in the second image, so in this case it's a very straightforward choice. This square format was made up of 2 horizontal frames, and I actually shot it like this more than a dozen times, so I've just shown you 6 of them here, but it is my favorite way to photograph the scene because it makes the most of the geometric quality, the symmetrical quality of the mountain. And I think it's fairly easy to pick a favorite here. Number 5 does have the most dramatic sky. The other images have great skies too, but they don't quite equal the way that that sky is broken up in number 5. But there's a couple more subtle reasons that you could look at. The first is the way the sunlight falls on the scene. I think in an ideal world I'd like to see the mountain in sunlight and nothing else, which of course you're never quite going to get, but we get pretty close here. So in image number 1 and to a certain extent image number 2, there's just a little less contrast between the mountain and the sand, but the rest all have the vast majority of the sand in shadow, so it's nice and black. And then an even more subtle point is the reflection of the water. So if we look at images 2 and 5 and compare them, you'll see that the river is much brighter in number 5, despite the fact that all of these images have been edited identically by synchronizing them in Lightroom. So the difference you see there is real, and it's caused by a cloud that is much brighter above the water in image number 5. So the cloud is sort of out of frame, and that's what the water is reflecting, whereas in image number 2 it's reflecting a much darker cloud, so you get less contrast. So even things that are out of the scene can affect how it's lit, and so for several reasons number 5 is the pick here, and I really couldn't hope for better conditions. I have to say it's pretty perfect given the subject matter. I had high hopes for this scene whilst I was shooting it, and I did again shoot it many times, but when I got home I decided it didn't really work. It's just a little bit boring, especially compared to the other images that I shot on that day. So we're going to skip this one and move on to the final scene. There's about half an hour between each one of these frames, and the light did change quite a lot through the day, and I was quite happy with images 1 and 2. But no prizes for guessing that it was number 3 that I chose here. So often the conditions change in a way that you don't anticipate. In this case, rain coming through, and it just adds an awful lot of depth and drama to the scene. And as Paul Mitchell said to me the other day, that rain has a beautiful quality of softening a landscape too, and I think that's certainly the case here. It feels both more dramatic and softer, so number 3 is a pretty easy pick here. Just tried a shot variation here, so that same central mountain idea, but you can see this beautiful patch of blue sky has opened out, and those of you who are familiar with clouds might notice that the edge of the cloud there has a lenticular quality to it, so that will be one of the clouds that has formed over the ice cap. But because that patch of blue sky was more or less symmetrically placed above the mountain, I think that was quite an effective way to create an even more centralized composition. The jury's still out on this image. I think the idea's a decent one. I think compositionally it works, but if I compare this to the images that I've already shown you, I think from a mood perspective this one isn't as interesting with this particular subject. To me, this mountain with the ice cap behind and a black sand desert, it's surreal, it's wild, and it's dramatic, and to incorporate blue sky into that, it brings in this idea of happiness and positivity, which actually doesn't really fit in too well with how I interpret this scene. So I'm going to keep this because it's different to my other images, but I think I certainly prefer the conditions in the other shots. And here's a shot that didn't initially occur to me, that just focuses in on that downslope coming down from the mountain with the ice cap behind there. But I think it works best if I zoom in a little and crop in. So this is the final shot. I had a pretty strong sense of what I wanted from this scene in terms of lighting. So the 4 shots here that I did take are in very similar lighting conditions, but there are some important differences, and particularly between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So that bottom row, you can see that the sunlight on the backdrop catches these areas of moss in the distance, and they do catch your eye, and they also create less contrast between that general area and the sunlit mountain. And I want that mountain to stand out as much as possible, so it's between images number 1 and 2, and this is a slightly harder one to call, but it's actually the second image that I like the most, because although the contrast is perhaps slightly less, I think the area that the river is flowing into is nicely broken up by slightly dappled light. And I also think that having that sense that just the edge of the mountain is really brightly lit by the sun is a bit stronger conceptually, so it's that second image that I'd pick in this case. All of those images were shot with a polarizer, and I thought I'd show you a quick demonstration of just what a polarizer can do for you, because you can see here is unpolarized, and here with a polarizer cutting out all of the glare on that volcanic sand. So a really important filter to have in your kit bag. Now we're going to move on to a slightly different location on the hill. So we're on top of a mountain now above our camp. Come on. We're on top of a mountain above our camp now, and I don't actually want to name the mountain or the mountain behind me because I'm hoping that the names will stay off YouTube again, so they're not searchable. So if you could do me a favour and not say where the location is, if you know, that would be brilliant. But we've got to the top of the mountain and I'm hunting for compositions, and again, some of the longer lens simple images work out the best up here. It can be very difficult to find good foregrounds in Iceland because there's a lot of broken rock, a lot of very young rock, and really complex foregrounds that can actually distract from what's a simpler wide landscape. But there is a nice foreground here that I think does work very well. In fact, I've just taken the photo, so now I'm just going to quickly talk you through my thought process and then show you the final image. This is the foreground that I think works quite nicely, and it's really a portrait frame, but I'll save you rotating the camera around into portrait mode. But obviously we have the rather spectacular symmetrical moss-covered mountain there in front of the ice cap, beautifully sunlit with this lovely river in front of it. So that's the rather obvious and straightforward backdrop. But this is the foreground feature that I am going to incorporate, this sort of basalt ridge here, and you can see it has this beautiful curve. So if I get closer and higher, you can see that curve is accentuated, and I can then zoom out. But as I do, the mountain is diminished in the background. So there's a balance here between getting close to this rock and high up so that you get this lovely curve, and maybe a bit of perspective too, but getting further back somewhere up here and zooming in to make the mountain a bit larger in the frame. And as I said, this is really a portrait frame for me. So zooming back out again, I'm going to crop pretty close to where the rock begins there at the bottom of the frame, and include some of the sky above as well. And I have just taken that shot, and I think it's going to come out really nicely. It was a focus bracket though, because I think I was shooting about 40mm, something like that, and it wasn't quite possible to get everything sharp in a single frame. So here's that finished image. This is my favourite image from the day. I think the foreground brings depth to the scene, but also ties in nicely with the backdrop. That sweeping curve is just about strong enough to lead the viewer into the background, but the lighting obviously makes it pretty clear what the star of the show is. From the perspective of understanding the wider context of the landscape, I actually think foregrounds can be hugely important. The problem with shooting the view without showing the ground at your feet is it gives that floating aerial perspective. And that's fine if the foreground is going to be detrimental to the overall aesthetics of the image, but I'll always have a hunt just in case I come across opportunities like this one, because I do think that this foreground makes a really positive impact to the image. I did mention that this was an exposure bracket, and I imagine some of you will want to see more of that process, but for the most part I don't want to focus on technique in these videos because I find composition and concepts to be more interesting to discuss. Anyway, there is another Iceland video on the way, but until then I'll leave you with the wise words of Jesus. That's what he was doing.
Don't forget to click, click like and subscribe.